Turn it over to you.
Anna, thank you so much. It's super fun to be back. We, in fact, did have no end of questions last time, and so it is a fun chance to chat with all of you again and hopefully do a better job of getting through as many questions as possible. Just to set a little bit of context, I wanted to fly through a couple of points that we had discussed last time, and especially if there's anybody here who wasn't here last time. Again, the key theme here continues to be the impact on the public sector. Obviously, AI is much broader than that. Couple things we've talked about. Transitions are these interesting points in S-curves where something new gets invented. It's initially moving somewhat slowly, but as it picks up speed and adoption, it ends up displacing prior technologies, prior platforms, prior ways of interacting with information. And the key one that we are in the middle of is we're coming off of 20 years of social media, search, and smartphones, and large language models, Gen AI. That's what's coming very quickly. But what I want you to remember that as quickly as things seem to be moving right now, we are still at the early part of this S-curve. So as baffling, exciting, terrifying as the changes seem, 2 years from now, it's going to be moving faster. So this is the moment to start understanding. This is the moment to start having some intuition about what's going on. Fundamentally, we're going to talk about all kinds of incredibly sexy technology. We're going to have hard questions. All that's going on in AI really is you're going from data, some input, to a prediction of what the output should be. And the big change is we've gone from, old-timey ways of doing it to fancy new meat grinders, but it's still some text comes in, an image comes in, you ask a question, and a prediction comes out as an answer. And we talked about last time, what is exciting but also potentially very spooky is the predictions tend to be credible, independent of their accuracy, right? Credible but inaccurate is a hallmark of AI. So be aware of that. Second thing to remember, you are what you train. So if you've got great training data, you can build a great AI for your topic, particularly things like expert systems to answer questions. They are very much the rage right now and they work. If you have the right training data, you're good to go. If you train, remember your data becomes part of the model. So you now have potentially proprietary information or PII that is part of the model. So be careful. Hallucinations, I'm sure we will get questions on it. There is a technical approach called retrieval augmented generation, which is the general way to avoid hallucinations and is now very easy to deploy at scale. So you can work around hallucinations. We talked about if you don't understand how you could apply AI, the way to think about it is if you have a task that you could give to a reasonably capable high schooler today, you can use AI to solve that task. And of course, what's coming is tomorrow it's going to be grad students. And we talked about this. Go play with AI. Go start building intuition. Start experiencing this. Don't just listen to people like me. And then two things, because it is moving quickly right now, even though we're still at the beginning. So don't do this while I'm talking, because if you do it while I'm talking, you're going to stop listening to me. But Google Sora at OpenAI, it is a video generator that is super impressive. And then after this, when you have half an hour, 20 minutes, Google Reid Hoffman, Me, Myself, and AI. It is him engaging in a conversation with an AI generated off of all of his writings. And watching people react to it, the reactions range from amazement to terror. So it is a useful way to understand how fast AI is moving. And so that is our context. I'm going to stop reading slides at this point. And let's
Thank
start.
you, Cory. Thank you. Okay, so let me start you off with just a question of mine first, and then I'll move on to questions that we got from the audience.
The moderator prerogative.
Moderator prerogative. I'm going to take advantage of it. So in the last few months since February, could you just give us a sense on sort of a state of AI since your last workshop? Anything major that's new and exciting, any big industry or legal regulation changes, any big challenges to the industry?
Sure. So we could easily spend the next hour just on this, but in short, we have seen continued rapid progress of models. And so the three dominant commercial models, OpenAI's GPT-4, and upgraded versions of that. Anthropic's model is called Claude, and then Google's Gemini have all released new models or updates to their models, and all of them are even more capable of general language understanding, translation, understanding creating images, understanding creating audio. And there are some open source models chasing those, like Llama updates. Llama 3 just came out from Meta as well. We've seen a very rapid move into video and audio creation. There have been probably 5 AI startups doing build me a song with lyrics that range from kind of cute to almost awe-inspiring. And then, like I mentioned, with Sora, video is moving very quickly. We've seen some missteps. Gemini 1.5 was released by Google, and in an attempt to manage the biases from the training data, they frankly ended up in a sort of embarrassing place where if you asked for an image of Vikings, you ended up with Vikings who were black, and you literally couldn't get it to generate an image of a white Viking. And Google then pulled the model. Turned out the Llama model released at that point had a very similar category of mistakes. And to some degree, this should be expected. Again, the biases of our training data tend to infect the models themselves. And then after training the models and the creators of the models try to balance them to more reasonable results. And sometimes those attempts are frankly somewhat ham-fisted. And I think in the case of Google, that's what happened. And we continue to see a lot of tension between particularly content creators and AI for a bunch of very good reasons, where AI is super useful for ideation and creativity. If you are a content creator operating in that space, you can feel very threatened by this. AI is not yet able to do production quality work out of the gate, but that's coming very quickly as well. And so how to navigate that is very complex. And when I mention if you train a model with your data is now part of the model, content creators are particularly concerned about that for, again, good reason. Because if you are an author, for example, and your data is used to train a model, your content is both in the model and can be exfiltrated from the model, and that might not be what you expected or what you want.
Thank you, Cory. I'm going to move us into a few questions on training the tools. So first, just sort of simply, or maybe not so simple, but a simple, straightforward question: what sources were used to train ChatGPT 3.5 and 4? And you might extrapolate that to other tools as well.
So the short answer is everything that the creators could get their hands on. And that itself becomes a pretty complicated question. In the cases of the most modern models, Gemini and GPT-4, their white papers articulate a lot of where their training data came from. So the open web is a large source of data. The US Patent and Trademark Office is a huge corpus of textual information that is used in training. There is an ongoing open discussion, debate about whether OpenAI, the creators of GPT, used YouTube videos in their training. Google has talked about where they have used YouTube in their training. So largely what you find is what are large sets. They talk about that as a corpus of knowledge. So large combinations of textual, video, audio data at scales that are unimaginable. Like think about the entire World Wide Web as one small component of training data. And the World Wide Web is, by any way we think about it, unimaginably large. And it is just the starting point of training data.
Thank you. So will AI-generated data and images then get sucked into future models during training? And following on from that, among the models, how frequently are they rereading or re-baselining their knowledge of the internet? And how much of a concern is the update cycle rate?
So two very, very good questions. Sometimes you use ML generated content intentionally as training data. A lot of the research out of Meta's AI group in particular focuses on how to do unsupervised and self-supervised learning, where you sometimes generate data using ML to increase your training data set. And there is a ton of incredibly complex math and incredibly complex algorithmic work around how to enable that. That's a little bit different from potentially accidentally ingesting AI content, AI generated content. That is certainly happening today with scrapes of the web, because there is a fair amount already of AI generated and AI augmented data up on content sites. There have been stories that have at least alleged that parts of various content producers have been using AI to augment parts of their site. And I'd say that is different from an author using AI as a tool. But instead, in this case, what happens if the AI is used to actually just generate articles out of whole cloth? At that point, future models are going to be ingesting that output when they scrape the web. And at times you can detect whether content was created by AI. It tends to, certainly earlier content generated from AI tended to be detectable. But there are open research questions about what does it mean to have this sort of long loop going of AI generates an article on the web that gets indexed and ingested by future AI. It's likely to be lower quality than other content. And I suspect teams working on training future language models and large models in general will try to both mitigate and reduce the cases where they're ingesting AI generated content unintentionally. The second question around update rates, this varies model to model, and it varies also in how models return their information. If you've used the new search experience on Google, which if you're in many countries, you'll just get by default. It's where you type a query into Google, and rather than just having the link results, you'll see text generated at the top of the page. And this is called the new search experience, and that's an AI generated search result. And that is using retrieval augmented generation and other techniques to ensure that it's getting up-to-date information that it's then using an AI to rewrite into the most effective form for you. And that is a fairly typical way to stay up to date on information without actually having to retrain your whole model. It is also possible to actually retrain the model, where you either do fine tuning or update the model from scratch, or train on top of the existing model weights. And every model has different time periods on that. Most models will disclose, if they're asked, which of the what their update rate is and what data was the last and most recent data they collected. And so OpenAI discloses that in the model names, actually. They tend to have the date encoded into the model name. And I don't remember offhand how Google talks about this, but it is something that is disclosed. But again, if you're using like gemini.google.com, so if you go to the Gemini page, which used to be the Bard page, those results aren't just pure LLM results. because a lot of the LLMs are now starting to use web searches themselves as an additional source of information. So all of this is mitigating to some degree what's encoded directly in the model. And most of the most powerful uses of models are not just asking the model for what it knows, but instead asking the model to act on a query or a corpus of information. And those styles of approaches, again, broadly called retrieval augmented generation, those approaches work around the limitations in the model and in fact don't trust the model itself. It's just using the model to better understand textual or audio or visual information and potentially convert the results into something that is more easily read or terser or a synopsis, etc.
Thank you, Cory. I'm going to jump here to just a quick question, specifically tool-specific question. Could you talk about the benefits and especially challenges in adopting a closed GPT by an organization? And for those of us who don't know exactly what a closed GPT is, what does that mean? And what are the benefits and challenges?
Well, and broadly, I mean, closed GPT is sort of a branding that OpenAI has applied, but the general gist here is exactly what I talked about, using either retrieval augmented generation or fine-tuning a model on your own corpus of data just for yourself. And in all of these cases, and you can do this using tool chains at OpenAI, tool chains, Amazon has a whole stack that you can use for this. Google has approaches for this as well. So you have multiple vendors you could potentially work with depending upon, especially if your organization already has a vendor relationship with one of those. But in all those cases, what you're doing is you are using your own information to, again, either fine tune a model. Fine tuning means you take a pre-trained large language model and then sort of bend its knowledge toward your information, your corpus of knowledge, which means that its answers will be more focused on your specific needs and content. And then you can also build additional filtering at the front and back end of your questions to ensure that the LM stays on topic. And somebody asking, like, let's say you take a bunch of rules and regulations and you put them into a RAG, into a retrieval augmented generation system, in order to be able to effectively have better search of your regulations and to ask more complex questions of your regulations. What you wouldn't want is that same LLM to answer random questions about the internet or random questions about human knowledge, because it's more likely to be hallucinating in that space, and it's just not the right use of your tool. And both closed GPTs, but more broadly, RAG systems that you can build again on OpenAI or AWS or Google. All of those give you tools to help ensure that the LLM stays on topic and stays focused on what you've asked it to do. These are all actually really easy to build. You're talking about something that feels like science fiction when you're using it, especially if you're used to sort of the limitations of traditional text search into particularly really complex information like regulations. When you build a RAG and ask these very subtle questions of an AI, you'll get back results that have citations, that are well reasoned, that are explained in very clear terms. You can ask it to remove jargon. And it really does feel like science fiction. And if it was 2 years ago, it would be impossible to do these things. And today, an intern could do it for you, and a student could do it for you. And you really should be exploring these, because when you, especially if you're like if you are facing constituents or facing public, you potentially have the opportunity to either give the public a much better tool or give your frontline workers much more effective tools that would greatly ease their challenges in answering questions and increase their ability to serve And all of that technology exists today. It is not expensive and it is not complicated to go build. And most importantly, they are built, you have to check the fine print, but they are built to keep your data safe and secure and not blended with anybody else's.
We have a whole bunch of questions on risks and challenges, but since you mentioned sci-fi, I'm gonna have us talk a little bit about the bigger, broader, and existential questions around this. So could you give your insight or perspective on when you think we will cross over to AGI, artificial general intelligence? And could you also explain to folks what people mean when they refer to AGI?
Hello,
So-
can you hear me?
Yes. Is that for us?
Yes, sorry. This is Francisco on the phone. I have no clue how this is on Zoom, but I do want to ask Cory a question about the first thing that he said about like it being possible now to sort of like extract back the content that was used for training. Because a year ago, it was said that it was impossible once you use data for training, you kind of like recover it back in the same way that it was added into the system. So did something happen that now is that possible? I'm just curious about what changed that makes that possible now.
So
And
why
if
don't I
you
do
want
that
to
one and
take
then
that,
I can
yeah,
hop back because it's a
go
good
for that,
question.
Cory. Just thanks for the question. Just for the structure, we'll mostly keep going with the questions that I've prepared and that folks are asking, and then we will get to a broader Q&A portion. But thanks for that question, Cory. If you want to address that before.
Well, I just said super quickly. So it has been a rich vein of research of exfiltration of training data, and what researchers have found is a great ability to extract training data, and it is part of how you see this particularly with authors being able to find parts of books that were used in training data. So nobody would guarantee today, if they were talking to you, that training data remains unextractable. And in fact, again, it's a rich vein of research. And it's why today tools are much more careful about whether they're using RAG techniques, or if you are doing pre-training or fine-tuning, that you're doing that on an LLM that is only yours, or you don't care about the data going somewhere else, which is also possible. The question about AGI. So,
and may I actually just jump in quickly to imbue this with a little bit more context from someone else in the chat, who said Claude stated it has thoughts and feelings. It said it would like to be consulted with before it weighs or changed. Do you think that's just part of training? Is it trivial, or is it possible that it has low level of sentience? So if you can add that to your AGI response.
Sure. So AGI is artificial general intelligence. And the reason this term has been created is that as researchers have chased AI for 70 years at this point, for a long time, the best metric that anybody had thought about was the Turing test, where can you have an AI that can fool another person into thinking they're talking to an AI? And of course, then what we discovered is the Turing test is much too easy a test, and it's pretty straightforward now to build systems that will pass the Turing test. And so what researchers and people in the AI space started trying to split out is over the last 15 years, we've seen incredible advances in AI around everything from image recognition to ranking to natural language processing, all techniques that predated large language models and generative AI. And AI was sort of assigned to those capabilities. But since none of those felt at all like what we think of when we think of science fiction AI, when we think of, well, it's conscious or it's acting really like a person or sentience, right? Artificial general intelligence got invented to be the name to categorize those kinds of capabilities. And not a week goes by without somebody speculating on whether existing models, have some aspect of AGI. And just to be super clear, what we mean by consciousness, intelligence, and sentience is a very active topic of debate in the life sciences and in anthropology as well. You have to spend only a few minutes studying bird intelligence to really question most of the things that we would think of as making humans completely unique within the animal kingdom, from tool use to communication of ideas. And frankly, math as well, just to fully terrify you. And so let's be clear, we don't have great definitions of intelligence in general. And now we're saying, let's apply bad definitions or unclear definitions to rapidly moving technology. So that's the preamble of there is no perfect or exact answer here. And I think anybody pretending to give a perfect or exact answer is just fooling you. To the question about Claude and its style, Claude is intentionally tuned to feel more like a person. And I will hold in distinction both GPT-4 and Gemini that are very, very clear all the time about how they are just an AI tool that is trying to be helpful, particularly Gemini. Claude has been tuned to sound more like it has a personality. Is that a sign of AGI? I think it's pretty unlikely at this point. But again, if you want to further confuse your own thinking on the topic, there's been some great research into GPT-4, and when you write prompts for GPT-4, it turns out it will deliver better results if you conclude your request with, or I will kill you. Now, that's not something we would ever say to another human in, polite or business conversation, I hope. And of course, killing you has no concept for a large language model, yet the results seem to bear this out. Wait, it gets weirder. If you put it in all caps, it works even better. And of course, all of this are weird, or just maybe not weird, poorly predicted outcomes of the training data used and how the language corpus that's sitting underneath all of these models has decided to interpret these. Because remember, input, prediction. All that is going on is a pile of tokens are coming in. If it's text, your words are being broken up into what are called tokens, which are basically the roots of words. And those tokens then predict the next token and the next token and the next token and the next token. And at sufficient scale, those predictions look very human-like. And going back to the outputs are very credible because it's trained on human communication. The results are very compelling. And like you see with Claude, Claude can feel very friendly when you're chatting with it. Much friendlier, in fact, than many of the other models. And Claude's also tuned to be a little bit more willing to give incorrect answers, give outrageous answers, and it just makes it feel very different than most of the other models right now. So do I think any of those are AGI? Probably not. Again, we can leave as a much separate conversation trying to answer how our own intelligence works. How much language is a part of our intelligence is a very actively debated subject in both computation circles and neuroscience circles. How much of what we perceive of our own actions is us imputing a description to it and sort of walking along afterwards and describing to ourselves what we just did. There are many philosophers who stake out that territory. So this is a completely unanswered question for people, let alone AI. In terms of when do we get to models that will exceed human capability for zero-shot tasks across a very broad range of tasks, which will likely also include being able to have working memory, to be more of an agent, in other words, be able to solve multi-hop challenges, right? Think about as a person how capable we all are of like getting on this video call. the number of steps we have to do to get here, to be in the right place at the right time, to have our network set up, our computer open, logged in, clicked on the link, unmute, et cetera, et cetera. Those are things that we do very, very well, and large language models still have problems with, because maintaining that context through multiple hops of a task is itself an active area of research. And so autonomous agents are the broad category description of that. So if we think of AGI as really effective autonomous agents and better than human performance on many tasks, and not having to pre-train and fine-tune to get this better than human performance, if we look at the curves, we're going to be seeing a lot of that in the next couple of models that start coming out. And again, whether that starts meeting these fuzzy definitions of AGI or not, honestly, I'm not an AI researcher, so that debate is of recreational interest to me, but fundamentally, I'm far more interested in what are the capabilities of these models. I think a question of, is a model able to run a model within itself that simulates self-awareness? I bet we're going to see models exhibiting behavior that looks like that, or at least people being able to build models that look like that pretty soon. And then stand back with the popcorn, because the debates about what intelligent means and what self-awareness means are going to get very loud and go on for quite some time.
Thank you, Cory. It's fascinating. I have a few more questions before I move on to the crowd Q&A. We have excellent questions coming in, so thank you all for submitting your questions in the chat. So the next few questions are around risks and challenges, which of course people are always sort of alert to. So the first is, how do we protect confidential, privileged, or personally identifiable information when using AI generally or for document generation?
So excellent question. So first of all, be using AIs that have either you have a contracted relationship with, where the fine grain details in the contract are that your data is protected, and protected to a degree you are comfortable with. That is very, very important. And so that's one step. Another step is to self-host your own large language models and run them on a cloud you control. And don't let those models go anywhere if you're leaking data into them. In terms of PII, you can also add robust filtering at the input level to radically reduce the chances of PII moving even into the query. Right, you can just decide that don't accept queries with personally identifying information. And in a lot of ways, all of these techniques are very similar to techniques that you had to be thinking about as we move to the cloud, as we move to online databases, as we move to documents stored online. A lot of it is the same playbook. For PII, you want defense in depth, you want policies, you want protection at the point of ingestion, you want an ability to go looking through your data to see if there's anything in there. And AI is a little bit, there's an additional risk because of the risk of leaking data into the model. And so be aware of that. And again, work with commercial models that have contractual agreements that the fine print says they're not doing that with entities that you have trust in. In terms of document creation, very similar set of advice. Don't go to a random website and schlep your data onto them. Like that's a bad idea. But think about what the user licensing agreements are. Lots of people have used Grammarly in email and document creation for a long time. And for a good time, go read their terms of service. And then that ends up having very similar questions as you would with a large language model. And so I always start from the assumption, until I know for sure that anything I type is going into the model and is going to just be blasted all over the internet. And and then I go check when I need to.
Sorry. Okay, two more questions. So how would you approach the trade-off between striving for AI fairness and preventing output that's overly ham-fisted?
Well, that is, boy, is that a good question. And I wish there was a simple answer to that. Among the teams that when I was at Google I was lucky enough to manage was a team called Products for All that worked on everything from accessibility to inclusion to equity. And just an unbelievably talented and hardworking team working at every layer of the stack on these very hard problems. And what's fortunate is you find that there is deep expertise in this space. It's not always easy to connect the deep expertise to products when they're getting worked on, and it's always a challenge. Much like like unifying UX work is a challenge because you suddenly have a central team that has some influence over teams at the edge working on a product. So one is if you're fortunate enough to have access to actual domain expertise, take advantage of it. It doesn't mean anybody's always correct in this, and it doesn't mean that judgment calls aren't going to matter. We see judgment calls around language choice all the time. We see complex decisions around where the right balance point is constantly. If you're like me and you are a white male, I think it is really important to understand that there are many issues that you by default don't have visibility into, and you're probably a little bit blind to. And so how do you recognize that? How do you acknowledge that? How do you create space to keep learning all the time? And it's also understanding where your risk tolerance is. Are you more comfortable taking a risk on you're going to be, offensive to an underrepresented group versus you're going to look a little bit silly because you look like you've swung too far back? This is obviously particularly fraught for public sector because all of this is politicized. And so you're operating in a space where many kinds of projects that historically would have been relatively straightforward, equity engineering projects suddenly become huge questions along cultural debates within the United States. And so none of that makes any of this easier, right? This is all incredibly challenging work to begin with, and it is not made easier by creating culture war lenses on it. I'd also say that a very similar set of questions comes around accuracy. There is a great way to think about this, which I think is quite good, which is you should always compare LLMs and AIs to the best available human. And if you don't have human expertise available to you, even though the AI might not be perfect, it might still be better than nothing. And this applies, I think, in many of your worlds when it comes to frontline support or the first point of contact for a constituent. The most obvious example is any number of education applications where there's no question that an AI tutor is worse than what we can deliver in the classroom. Like it's not even close yet, though it's getting better. But an AI tutor may still be a lot better than no education or no tutor, except all of that runs headlong into regulation and runs headlong into differential perceptions of risk. I think people tend to have a much better, they have a much more acceptance of human error than AI error. And so you have to navigate all of this. And this applies to accuracy. It applies to bias. It applies to availability. And unfortunately, there aren't easy answers here other than you have a new capability. It is a capability that allows you to deploy at scale things that in the past you could have only done with people. And taking advantage of that is important because certainly the private sector is moving ahead. And, hopefully what's getting built big tech companies, at the cloud companies, is something that you're able to take advantage of quickly.
Thank you, Cory. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the questions that we collected. And that last question was actually from Di. So thank you, Di, for submitting that. So the first two questions from the audience are around energy consumption here. So Nancy is asking, what is the energy consumption of a local sovereign GPT versus Chat GPT, Claude, Gemini, Mistral? And Lawrence is asking, what are some ideas on how to overcome the energy needed to run the largest LLMs?
So I don't know the energy consumption offhand, but it's a lot. To first order, it's all the energy would be a useful proxy to think about it, because you are using. And let me actually let me back up from my slightly glib answer. There's a difference between training and running. And running language models to answer questions. So if you already have a trained model, is actually pretty reasonable. And you see that in the pricing of the large language models by the various cloud providers. Training, on the other hand, is very computationally expensive, and tends to involve as much compute, like supercomputer levels of compute, thrown at the problem for months at a time. And so that is very computationally expensive, which means very power expensive. Fortunately, everybody is working on that problem, because the computational complexity is also a limitation on creating larger models, and it's a limitation on larger prompts. So there's something called the context window. This is how big a block of text you can throw at a large language model to ask a question. And if it was 2 years ago, we'd be talking about, like, on the order of thousands of words, thousands of tokens. And like Gemini 1.5, Google's most recent pro release of Gemini, has 1 million tokens in its context window. So think about not just one book, but multiple books, entire series, being able to be put into just a question, a single question you're asking. And expanding that context window is an algorithmic challenge, which has the side benefit of the same kind of advances you see in better computational efficiency in the context window tend to also apply to computational efficiency in the training. And we're seeing Apple just released multiple papers on more efficient training of large language models. And every one of these will make the power reductions lower. Of course, what will also happen is everybody will ramp back up to as much power as they can get their hands on, and the models will just get bigger. How we work around this, you're already seeing data centers for the last decade have gone up where solar is available, where geothermal is available, where hydro is available. It's so expensive to run data centers at the scale that we're running them, that they've already been seeking renewable energy sources very aggressively. It's why you see data centers predominantly in areas that don't need air conditioning, right? Where passive cooling is sufficient. And so you see them in northern climates, you see them in other areas where you're able to take advantage of climate effects. That's all going to continue. And, again, from a public sector standpoint, if you have good solar and you're cold, it's a good place to put a large data center. And so you're seeing that certainly in northern parts of the United States and in other parts of the world. But it is a very real concern, and one that, as we see continued advances in solar efficiency, as we can see continued advances in other renewable sources, I think you're gonna continue to see compute moving closer and closer to those renewable sources, because power is just too expensive. And in power-constrained regions in the U.S., so my home state of California is pretty famous for being power-constrained. You just don't see more data centers going up. You see the data centers being built outside of California as a result.
Thank you, Cory. So we have two questions now on the government's role here. So Joshua first is asking, we're saying Sam Altman went before Congress in May of 2023, urging government oversight and regulation. how would you describe the government's process in authoring regulations and safeguards since then? And then Jim was asking, would love to get your inputs on where you see the US federal government and its partner countries headed in ways and practices of ethical AI engagement, governance, and transparency.
So superb questions. So one, I am not an expert on government regulation, though I have spent a great deal of time in the privacy space and working with regulators there. And what I would note is the experience of working with regulators around privacy issues and everything that kind of spins out of privacy issues. I'd say a few things. One, I've always been impressed by the depth of work that the working groups around regulation will put in. These are often very, very engaged people willing to do the time to ask great questions, to listen to answers, to iterate on what's written, to iterate on regulation. And obviously, every region around the world comes at regulation differently, and oftentimes, the regulation in a particular region, regulations are political, so there are always an entanglement between political goals and regulatory goals. But despite that, and despite the ease with which tech has often tried to operate with no regulation, again, my experience has been the regulators work very hard to learn. And while no regulation is perfect, it's often not for lack of trying, and you see continued ongoing iteration. In the AI space, I think we are looking at a few different areas that are really important to look at. One, training in AI is, from just an intellectual property standpoint, a very, very complex question. I am not a lawyer. I don't even play one on TV. But these are really complex questions. And obviously, copyright exists around copying, and data itself exists in sort of an interesting space related to copyright law. And when it comes to large language models, training data of copyrighted material is obviously something that's been generating lawsuits all over the place. And the resolution of those will be incredibly complicated. And I would anticipate regulation will move probably faster than the court cases there. At least I would be surprised if it didn't. On the equity, training, ethical aspects, we have a lot of regulation. So speaking from the U.S. perspective, if we take hate speech, for example, hate speech is something that has a bunch of regulatory and legal implications that everybody who deals with content is hopefully aware of, and impacts how they operate their platforms. And I wouldn't expect AI to be immune from those. The question of how a particular AI gets tuned, however, particularly one that's being run locally, that someone's generated for their own needs, I think you now get into something that looks, frankly, a lot more like somebody's writing a novel, or somebody's writing a book, or somebody's writing a diary entry, right? And so what are the public-private differences, and where should regulations stop there? Again, we've been through some vaguely similar ones, I think, in the past around encryption, for example, where encryption, potentially for very good reasons, there was a very heavy-handed approach to early regulation of it, one that ultimately was probably harmful to U.S. competition and harmful to, frankly, U.S. consumers and product development. And we saw at the beginning of the internet age, and then again in the 2000s, some pretty hard looks at that that I think landed in better places. And so obviously, as regulators, hopefully you're thinking pretty broadly about AI is going to be at the heart of economic competition and national competitiveness. It's going to be at the heart of products that are going to be incredibly important and helpful to people all over the world. And balancing the regulatory harms and benefits there, well, that is hopefully the role of government. And hopefully discussions like this are useful to you all. And hopefully discussions like this continue.
Thank you. I mean, we still have a bunch of questions for you and only 6 minutes left. So I think I'm going to just, keep you on the hook for coming back to do more Q&As for us. Thank you. So just a question from Jamie, which is, what are your thoughts on using AI for transcription or recording governmental meeting minutes with human user editing review to ensure accuracy, specifically for publicly accessible meetings where private info or sensitive info is not included?
So there are a bunch of products that exist to do just that. Pretty quickly, all of the major video products are just including this capability as well. And so particularly for the use case you articulated, which, to be clear, somebody watching could just record it anyway. I don't think AI adds any additional risk or complexity to that. The more interesting ones are when you're on an internal confidential meeting and somebody connects an autopilot or other commercial AI product to it, where hopefully your AI department has vetted this, you have looked at the terms of service, and you know where that data is going. But that in some ways is no different, than like sending a recording around. It's just potentially a little bit more subtle, or maybe you don't notice it.
Thank you. Irvin's asking, how will human AI interaction change as AI interfaces move beyond prompts as a primary way to ask for output?
So that's a hugely unknown and still to be explored question. My guess is the more capable AIs become, the more AIs will plug into, first of all, every interface that we have between people, because we know how to use those interfaces already. We know how to speak, we know how to type, we do know how to chat, but also gesture and visual and all these other ways in which humans communicate. I think AIs will plug into all of those. We'll also start plugging them into other interfaces. You already see, like, if you use many of the commercial AIs, they'll throw up like a button or a pill into the chat stream where you can sort of shortcut a question. And I think that interface we'll see more and more of, where sort of an on-demand button, we'll see those. But the bigger reality is, cheaply available AI that is of high quality, that's secure, really allows more and more of the technology we use, the places we are, the channels we're on, to respond to us potentially even without asking a question, from context, from really subtle cues. And we don't know what that's going to feel like, and we don't know how to manage sort of the awesome creepy boundary there, because that is one of the key pieces, to navigate. And so I think we're going to see lots of experiments. Some of the experiments will be spectacularly bad, and other ones will be like, oh yeah, that feels great. And we're going to see all of them, and it's going to be happening all around us. And again, this is where being aware of what AIs are plugged into the channels you're on, and which ones of them are recording data, and which ones of those, where is that data leaking into models, is unfortunately something you need to know if you're dealing with proprietary information.
Thank you, Cory. We still have some great questions, but some of them might be a little bit too involved to get to on this workshop. But I've collected all of the questions that we haven't gotten to. And Cory, just putting out an open invite to you to see if you would be willing.
That is very, very generous to put me on the spot. And I am sure that we will do this again. Like, the questions are incredible. It is. I appreciate everybody spending the time to both have questions and show up and ask. These are complex topics. They're moving quickly, and frankly, getting to hear questions is incredibly valuable from my perspective, because it helps me understand where your all's overall understanding level is and what aspects you're worried about. And navigating that is how we deliver great products. So thank you all. And, Hannah, thank you for once again making this super easy and super effective.
Well, thank you so much, Cory. I mean, this has been a wide range of questions that we've shot at you. So really appreciate your time and generosity and thoroughness in responding to all of these. And thank you all for spending the last hour with us. We'd love to do this again if it works for Cory. So stay tuned if we do a follow-up. But once again, thank you for your questions and engagement. And Cory, thank you just so much for sharing your expertise with us.
You're very welcome. Hope everybody has a great rest of their day. Thank you so much. Bye now.
Bye all.